Welcome, everybody, to another Game Master Happy Hour. How's everyone doing tonight? I'm Tyler from the Min-Max Podcast, and I am joined by some very fine gentlemen. Everybody, go ahead and say hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Oh, hey.
What's up?
I didn't
Oh,
notice
hi,
you
Mark.
there.
Yeah, I see you hiding behind that camera.
Yeah, oh, look at that. So, tonight, we have a very interesting conversation to have. Tonight, we're going to be talking about railroading versus player agency. Now, there's a lot of discussion to be had when it comes down to, in my opinion, is versus the right way to put it, or should it be multiple choice? But this
Column A, column B.
Yeah, exactly. But the whole point of tonight's discussion is to talk about player choice, how to handle player choice at your table, how we specifically handle player choice at the table, and have a discussion and have a few drinks. So
That's what we do.
That's what we do.
Sounds like a good plan.
Cheers, folks.
Yeah.
I'm just going to show off this cup real quick. My good buddy Dustin brought this to me this weekend as a early Christmas GM appreciation gift. And it's not a bowl, but it does have whiskey in it. So cheers.
Toss it to your other side, Adam. Your beautiful logo is blocking your cup. There you go. Yeah, there it is.
There it is.
Nice.
So
All right.
Yeah. So what do you guys think about, being that we all run adventure paths? I think there's a good argument to be made right out of the gate that we all at our individual tables have chosen to put our tables on rails, so to speak. Could we all agree to that reasonably?
Yeah, I think so.
An already predetermined plot of sorts.
And I think that one of the biggest things that I think I would call back to is this ties in really closely to session 0.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that all week.
Same. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things where, because we chose to do adventure paths instead of homebrews, this is definitely a one-sided conversation to an extent, right? But what is everybody's experience with doing any sort of homebrew? Does anyone have any experience with that?
Well, I mean, I think we all do, even though we're running APs. At least, though we're running, STF is running an AP, we add a lot to it. You know what I mean? And with that comes some homebrew. And then in some of the games that we've done off pod has been even more of that to some degree, particularly like our first big campaign that we did. There was whole months worth of play that were homebrew kind of added into the story.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, like it's, Heath and I got into a discussion about this on one of our Tom Talks, and like separating homebrew as a clean break from running APs doesn't sit well with me, because I think that there's spaces for both at the same time.
I would agree.
Yeah, we had a great conversation, Steve and I, with Tim Hitchcock. That was basically like, if you don't homebrew half of each book you're running, you're not doing it right.
Yeah.
Like, I'm giving you the framework. I'm not giving you the A to B to C that you should absolutely have to do. But I'm leaving breadcrumbs for every group to latch onto. So if one group likes this and one group likes that, then that GM includes this piece and that GM includes that piece. So I think even with an AP, you're doing home brewing to some extent. From my perspective, I haven't done a written recording in like months.
In a while, yeah.
In a little while. Our main
rails,
pod took a jump right off the rails, and when I do the Evil Interlude stuff, that's all homebrew as well. So I think to some extent you definitely you tend to railroad more in an AP, and I can give an example just based off of the AP that I'm running, and maybe we could bounce some comparisons between what I'm running and what you guys are running in terms of how much you have to railroad. But my AP becomes a chase in book 3. It's a chase until book 6, and that makes it very linear.
Right.
There's not a ton of ways to deviate, and there's not a ton of sandbox past like the second book. And I think Paizo has a couple of APs that definitely have more sandbox elements, and I think that's where you get to provide more agency. There's definitely a couple books that are written that are just like, here's encounters that happen in this book, and what order they happen in is up to you, and all of that. And that's great. And that really feels like it's not on the rails to your players. But when you're in a story that's very, hey, you're chasing this person to here, and once you get there, you find out that that person's here. Okay, well, it's a little hard not to feel like you're on the rails in that scenario. And that's why when I'm running a AP like that, I like to interject some stuff. As has happened. I've interjected some stuff that's like, okay, well, you're on a completely side quest thing right now, and you guys have chosen to go do that, and that's fine. But I think that's how you have to do it in some of these very linear APs. You have to be the one that's you're almost railroading them to have more choices. You're like,
that's a good point.
Well, I'm pushing this in. I'm pushing this thing in, and now you have all of these choices that you can make, and you don't feel like you're on that one track.
Yeah. Right. And I think about it as like player agency and railroading is kind of like a balance between the GM and what they have prepared for the session, and then what the players actually decide to do. So it's kind of a give and take in my head. And I've been fortunate enough for most of my books so far have kind of been open sandboxes. So I haven't had to like as clearly be like, hey, this point is over here. I'll be like, you have a map with a bunch of landmarks on it or something like that. Or I think what I've fallen into, and some of the things that I feel like are more railroady coming from me, is when I have an NPC who's giving out a task. That still kind of feels railroady to me, but I think that you can kind of downplay railroading by just giving your characters the logical reasons that they would need to do the tasks that you kind of had planned for them. And if they decide that they want to do something else, then that's just kind of, you're playing defense at that point. Hopefully you can kind of steer them back over, or you can kind of skin something away to kind of have a plot detail in this thing that they want to go do.
I think, going back to your point, Tyler, if you're going to do an AP, there has to be an agreement at the table at the start that the players are invested in following this story. Now, that being said, the players don't know where the story is going to go. And I saw a lot of questions coming through this week that kind of talk about the idea of, well, the players are just looking for clues, and they might latch onto something that seems important to them, but it really has nothing to do with the story of the book. And that's where I think things can become interesting. It can be a challenge, but you just roll with it, and as long as it doesn't get too far off the beaten path, I think, and we'll get into it, I guess, more late as we discuss it, but there are ways to kind of like bring it back around without putting a hard stop in front of somebody. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because even with that agreement going into an AP and saying, okay, I know that this AP has a story and it has encounters that are written in the book, and we're going to have to go do those things. You can still give some legitimate player agency. And if you GM properly, and I hate to say that, but you know what I'm saying? If you skillfully GM,
if you don't fuck it up,
you can create this illusion of player agency, and make it feel like that their characters are the one that are choosing this path rather than this path being put down before them.
Yeah, and I think another big thing that has to do with that is when they make a decision that's a little bit outside of what you were thinking, don't say no to it, say yes, and then adjust backwards from what you had planned to kind of suit that action now, instead of being like, no, you have to go to this place first and go see this person and do this. You can't just You can't just run around the building and dive through a open hole in the fence. That doesn't work. Or example.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say the yes and is
A
both.
tenet of improv.
Yeah,
There,
improv.
Let's go and get that out of the way.
Get the improv out of there. Tag it. No, I think yes and it has both micro applications and macro applications. Like when you're talking about how a player overcomes a particular obstacle or a particular encounter, being flexible and being able to say, you know, hey, there's a stat block in front of me on the book, but they did something that was so well placed for the story, either with diplomacy or some sort of social skill, or you know, the wizard did something specific to end combat before it even began. I think you shouldn't force them to go through that encounter as it's written. Make it flow around the table, right?
For sure.
And that's a micro application. The macro application has to be your big points in the story, and how their choices still move them in the direction of the next story beat in whatever path they want to take to get there. So that comes to that illusion of choice, I think, is probably my favorite term for this. Like, yes, there's choice, right? And how you get to from book 1 to 2 to 3, but in session 0, we covered, hey, we're building characters who have an interest in doing this, right? For my EP, it's a little easy. It's you're all circus performers. Make characters who would have an interest in saving the world, right?
It's pretty good.
But that's a weird thing to ask of your players, like, you know, and you guys are doing a great job, so I'm not casting shade on what you're doing, but that is a weird thing, character concept to create. Make circus performers who are typically on the outside of society and live in a very close, protect our own type of, you know, that's at least the ideas that come in our heads when we think about that, right?
Sure,
and then to say, okay, you also need to want to explore the world and save it is a weird kind of like push and pull, which, I mean, that's what the AP is asking for, right? And you guys have done that, but I think you've run into it a couple times of like your characters being like, well, why are you asking us to do this?
We're
right?
circus people. Why is the mayor here?
Exactly.
Right? No, and to be honest, it like priming them for that at the beginning, and I think anybody who would run Extinction Curse might run into that same thing, because, you know, they're playing circus folk. They want to be goofy. You know, they want to screw around with their RP, but they knew where it was going. Not every story beat, but they knew that there were story beats to come. And again, that goes back to session 0. We had that discussion, and that gives them the ability to be creative through constraints.
And so let me ask you this. Do you think that homebrew is like, and I know the answer to this, but to start kind of at an obvious thing and work our way down, homebrew can be just as railroaded as an AP, right? Like that's
Absolutely.
so what is railroading, and why has it gotten such a bad rap? You know, why was the negative connotation that surrounds railroading for y'all?
Well, I would say, first off, when you're bringing it to the home brewing can be just as railroady, I would argue that it is more railroady. And I think that's because a lot of game masters get precious with their own ideas. And when something is your idea and the players try and take that in a different direction, you're much more inclined to pull back and get them back on track to your idea, because you want what your big written plan that you put arguably more effort into than maybe we do in terms of story beats, because you're writing all of your own story beats. I think the temptation is definitely there to completely railroad a homebrew.
Yeah.
And I think an adventure path actually sometimes gives you a little bit more flexibility to yes and, because you have a framework of the entire story and all the story beats, and that lets you shift them around a little bit better than your one path to get where you need it to be in a homebrew.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will say, like, you know, your 10-minute GM and whatever will say that, hey, yeah, homebrew can be completely fluid, and yeah, it can, but then don't pretend that it has some overarching story. You're
Right.
kind of
You're just
you,
kind of freewheeling.
you're kind of
as you
going
go.
from A to B to C and hoping that at some point two things connect, and it's like an aha moment that your players basically figure out before you even realize you planned it.
Right. Well, so what do you think is why is railroading bad? You know,
I
or
think
do you
it,
think it's bad?
I think obvious railroading is bad.
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
you don't want to just be like, you don't want to tell your, I mean, with this type of game, you don't want to make them go around the board and in a circle to collect all the pieces before they can win. And I think that's just kind of what it implies. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, it also just kind of describes the fact that there is a storyline that could be followed or that the GM has prepared for you to follow. And when you are sitting down with a table with the GM and four players, the GM's playing too. You don't want to, like, I don't know, if I'm playing, I don't want to have my GM have to make up something completely new on the spot, just because I know what work that takes in the moment. But I think it's just shutting down a player's choice in lieu of how you want or expected them to go for it, or like
Yeah.
even being too controlling about like character creation or something like that. Being like, no, you don't want those feats. Those feats are stupid, or just dismissing kind of fun ideas, even if you know that they're not optimized. You can hint and be like, maybe you're not going to run into a lot of undead here,
Right.
but other than that, I would say, yeah, pick a cool spell that isn't
That seems
the
cool to
damage
you.
spell that everybody takes, and
Yeah.
grab something else.
What about you, Tyler? What's wrong with? Because I'm going to come at this from a different angle. So I want you to tell me why it's bad if you think it's bad.
You're talking about an railroading
Yeah.
specifically.
Yeah.
I'm gonna echo Griff just a little bit because some of the most railroady experiences I've had have been with homebrew GMs. Like Griff said, that's their baby. They put months of work into it, and if the players want to do something else or what the GM perceives to be a perfectly laid out plot hook, and the players just waltz by it, time after time, that's maybe hurts the ego a little bit for a lot of GMs, and sometimes that makes table play awkward. And
Yeah.
that's probably why it would be a bad thing. But some of the homebrew GMs that I've had experience with that are more fluid in the process and where they lay out a sandbox as opposed to a straight line, and then the story accidentally comes together because of choices the players make. Sometimes those are people's favorite kinds of games.
Yeah.
So I think all homebrew games are, in my opinion, either on the way one side of the spectrum or the way other side of the spectrum. I haven't had much experience in between in a homebrew game. So,
Yeah, and I think a homebrew game in column B is very much just the story of the players. It's not going to be like a world-saving plot until, you're high level and the GM just decides, okay, well, I'm going to throw this threat at you. But it's like, okay, your backstory said your parents were from this town. That's where we're gonna head, and these things are gonna happen on the way. And then you're gonna find out somebody, it's not like, hey, there's this far off evil guy that's threatening Absalom or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not a part of it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not that kind of game.
Well, here's the thing about railroading that, and we've talked about it, like obvious railroading is bad because then the players feel like they don't have any stake in the game, right? That you're just moving their pieces for them. And we don't, that is bad, right? Because you want the players to feel like their choices that they make for their characters matter. But I think some light railroading, I think it gets a bad rap overall, because oftentimes too, when you got 4 to 5 players, all with different not egos, but different thought processes, right? About how they hear a story and how they process it and how they make decisions. And at some point you get 4 to 5 different opinions on how to move forward with nobody really knowing what to do. You know, that can be a result of failing to lay out a direction for your
absolutely.
players to take. And the only way to do that is to put a little bit of nudges and kind of keep things on the road. And so I think the rails part of it is the hard part, right? Like if it's on rails and you can't change lanes and you're just stuck on this path with no movement off your direction, that's a problem. But if you can road somebody, you know what I mean? Because there's lanes and there's detours that you can take that you couldn't take on a train. But you still got to get back to the main road. If the purpose of your particular game is not to organically develop a world together in a completely improvised homebrew situation, and you're wanting as a table to tell a big grand story, well, somebody's got to kind of pull those strings so that story has some weight and payoff, right? True. And I think a little bit of railroading and guiding the players is not a bad thing, personally.
I'm gonna put a touch, because I think that is, it's almost the beginning of the railroad that you're gonna be put on, is what everyone's kind of scared of happening. Like the choice is the beginning of the railroad to go down this path. So I think the trick is to make your train station as appealing as possible, and that's not railroading to be like, hey, look at that nice ass train station over there. It could get you somewhere
really
far.
Sweet train station.
Yeah. There's a bunch of magic items in that train station. Your mom's over there. I don't know. Well, like it's not railroading for you to have NPCs go about what you think they would do, just in the days that your PCs are off doing something else, to try to attach them back into like whatever main plot you're trying to get to. If you can have the big bad capture your best friend or something, and is that railroading, or is that just, oh, you're in a bad place and you've made an enemy and now you have to deal with an enemy?
Well, I think you've introduced the perfect thing to create both an illusion of choice and to get your players back on the railroad is real consequences.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
If you have real consequences in your campaign, your players will always feel like they have a choice because they've done something and something went wrong because they did that thing.
Or something went right.
Choice. Or something went right. Yeah.
Right.
And those consequences will also act as the impetus for them to get back into the story. So if they go off on a side quest, foster that, but just know that, to your point, stuff is happening in the background of this story. Stuff is still happening. For example, with mine, it's like you're on a time limit. And so if you go do this side thing, you can go do that side thing, but there will be major consequences for you having done so.
Right. Right.
Do you pose that question to them at the table as they're having that discussion about what to do? Just out of my own curiosity, as a style question, I guess.
Do I say there's going to be consequences for this action?
Yeah.
No.
No. Okay, got it.
I impose the consequences later.
There, you don't ask the question.
I think that those kind of things are discussed like outside the table, maybe, again, back to session 0, that it's like, you guys are going to be able to make the choices that you want to make, but let me just tell you how I'm going to GM this game, is that your choices matter. You know what I mean? And even though we're playing on like on a predetermined story path, there's a lot of ways that we can get to point A and B, and the choices that you make will affect what B looks like at the end. You know what I mean? Or at the next stage. Or, and I don't know, man. It's players have choice even if they're on a scripted path. And to Griffin's point, let them go fuck off somewhere, and then let them come back and see that town burned up because they weren't where they said they were going to be, and some shit went down, you know?
And Tyler, to your point, I think it wouldn't be right of me at the table to say, by doing this, it's going to have consequences, because I want them to do genuinely what they think that their characters would do.
Which I 100% agree with. Absolutely. I think that when it comes down to the choices that they make, I want to kind of ask how that gets done at your guys' respective tables. Like how do you guys keep track, a little behind the curtains here, choices that the players make and how it impacts the story? Because maybe I think we've all individually concluded here that in some metaphor, it doesn't have to be a railroad, but it's a road with multiple options, right?
Mhm.
Especially in our AP tables that we run APs at. So how does that look for you on the process in the back end? I'll give an example from what I do. I have main NPCs that I have a notebook, and each of them have a page dedicated to it. And when there's a choice that the players make or somebody that gets away during the process, I note, what does each NPC react to this action? And when the players do finally meet that NPC, you have an idea of how that NPC views them right out of the gate, so that you can adjust any personalities that you're given within the books to look at the players the way that they would look at themselves if they, went back and thought about all their actions from this person's perspective. That's something I do.
So what are you asking then here is like, how do we handle a situation where they approach that this is like kind of a scripted encounter with an NPC?
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's a scripted encounter or just how that NPC reacts to choices that they've made, or maybe even just full-on encounter adjustments from book to book that you might make based on, again, choices that they've made early on in the story.
I mean, for me, a lot of that just depends on what those choices are and if they would impact the given situation, right? So there might be some choices they make along the way that don't really impact this, but then it's a hard question because it's so situational, at least for me. And I don't have stacks of books, like notebooks with detailed notes on my NPCs. Like I have like little notes that I have on like a document or whatever, like a Google Doc, but what I do is I just try to spend some time in the head of the NPCs, and like I'll walk around my house as the NPC, just trying to like, okay, this is kind of how this person is, and then I'll just react in the moment like I feel like that NPC would. Now if they do something in that conversation and I know that they're going to meet that NPC later, I'm going to note and remember how those conversations went, so that the next time they see the NPC, the response is congruent with what they've done. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Yeah, it does, because I mean, it goes beyond just like, because we all know that, when you have chapter X or, chapter 2 of book 3 is this, quote, dungeon, whether it's a house filled with rooms that are labeled with encounters, whatever the case may be, those things, I can imagine, maybe this is an assumption on my part, that we all hit those things, right? Like if there's a dungeon in your book and it contains story relevant information, you try to drive your NPC or your players to that location.
Sure.
Because that's where the story's leading, right?
I have an occultist, so they already know.
They've seen the person that was already there.
I'll give you an example. So, this is mild spoilers for Signal of Screams, very mild, but they meet some famous athletes when they arrive at where it takes place. And there's an encounter in the book with those athletes that I just removed wholesale because it was unnecessary for my group of players, and because of the interaction that they had with them when they first met them. Like I just said, we can do something else with that time, and I'm not going to force this encounter because it's on the tracks, because I don't feel like it jives with where my players' headspace is at, and it's not going to build the characters any, and it's not going to really shift the story that much. So I just cut that out and then put something else in based on what they had already done at the resort, because that's a pretty sandboxy book there. I mean, it's not
Sure,
a huge
yeah.
sandbox like a full city or anything, but you have this really huge resort that you basically spend the first 10 hours of play just exploring, and so I wanted to reward the things that they were interested in, and make sure that those were the things that were developing the story rather than forcing whatever the book was.
Gotcha.
That might be a better example.
I have a similar example where I ended up just not having them do an encounter because they knew that there was going to be an encounter there, but instead of deciding to go in and fight it, they decided to get tricky about it. So I wasn't just gonna have this encounter go off and like normal with whatever they did not mattering in the end, but when I balance what I see my players trying to do with what I know the story is, I try to see what they're trying to do with the decision that they made, and then understand it, see if I have any information that might make what the logic of their decision like tamper with it and or anything like that. And if I have any information that they don't have, there's a definite consequence that could come from it. But if I see that they just made the right decision in the case, then you have to honor their correct decision and how to go about an encounter or a situation, a role play even.
Yeah, I think as far as the illusion of choice has affected my prep, to your point about scripted encounters, like I almost don't use those anymore. I just have stopped doing so because things change drastically and they change quickly, and I like to have an idea of a character's personality and motivations, but I've kind of stopped going to the book and saying like, this character says this to them. I start prepping in concepts and ideas and things that the character knows. And I think the illusion of choice has only added to the breadth of characters in my stories because it ends up like, you're going on a side route. I'm homebrewing all of the people here. They're all now real characters in this story, whether my players know it or not. Like a character like Pavlos, the cleric in book 2 of my story, is not a real character and came to them with like a ton of information that I just decided, well, I'll give this character that information because they've gotten close to this character, because they know this character, and because they trust this character. By the same token, like my players treating like some undead intelligent creatures with like a shred of humanity allowed me to twist the story, and instead of being these things fight to the death, they end up testifying for them in court.
Right.
Like there's so much you can do with your players' choices in the moment that I feel like sticking to a script really hurts me more than it helps me. And so I like to be able to just kind of warp things however I feel like, because realistically, my prep never would have included, hey, the party allies with these things and now they're going to come testify. Like
Right.
my prep never would have had that. So I know I'm going to have to last minute, like add something in about what they're going to talk about in a trial now.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I'm never going to prep for that a month in advance. Right. That's
Well,
something
you
I'm going to prep
can't,
immediately.
right? Yeah, you got to
Yeah.
just roll with it, and
Yeah.
it's so important that when you get to a point to where the players are kind of having some out of character talk, or even if they're having like an in-depth conversation in character, that is your cue to shut up and listen, because they're going to give you so many ideas. They're going to make it so much better just based on what their assumptions are, and you can then respond to those assumptions and either subvert them, or like, oh fuck, that's a good idea, I'm gonna add that in there, like. And if you're not listening, and if you're too busy trying to like say no, this you're going the wrong way, I need to pull you back over here, you're missing some opportunities, and there is, we've talked about it already, there is many ways that you can get yourself back to the story without shutting a creative idea down, and as you know, yes anding is I preach that to the STF all the time. Like improvisation, yes, and being the tenets of it is so important for if you're really going for a player GM collaboration, building a story together rather than a GM telling you a story that you're just kind of clicking buttons through a cutscene on.
Right. Yeah. So now, in hindsight, I find that my initial question should have been more along the lines of where and when do you take over for these important story beats, as long as you're still, following the road that's been laid out before you in the AP, right? Maybe the next question I'm gonna kind of pose, and this is something that I know I've seen people do, and I've heard stories of people doing it, is taking an AP, playing through either a certain number of books through it, and then come to find out that the characters and the players are trying to tell a different story. Do you finish that book, or do you finish that adventure, or do you take a left turn with them? I don't know if any of you have any experience with that.
I haven't yet, but there's still time.
Yeah, there's still time.
Still time.
There's certainly still time.
Yeah.
I can say that I kind of have experience with what you're saying, but not like the full party is doing something differently.
Sure.
And like if one character feels like they're on a different path, maybe that character, it's free for them to leave the story, and you can maybe pick up a different story with them down the line.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how I
have definitely done that, where a character, by organic and true development, not by like just being antagonistic to the plot, but just the way things went, like legitimately became separate from the main party's objectives, right? And so when you do that, you have an option. You can say, all right, player, do you want to make a new PC, and we'll write this one out, and they can exist still in the world doing things, but that'll be more like it becomes a GM NPC at that point. Here's how this is gonna affect the story. Or do you say, all right, well, do you want to do some one-on-one sessions and go explore this, and then come back to see if your character gets to a place to where they want to come back to the group? And and I have done that. Now that you got to have some time and commitment and energy to do that, but definitely did that with Josh, and with this case it was more so because of like real life issues making it difficult for him to be there on a regular basis, but it was also at a place in the story where it made sense for his character to go on their own journey. And so we did that. I took him through a whole couple levels worth of stuff when he had the time, because he was overseas, and so we would arrange times to do one-on-one kind of stuff. And then when he was able to come back and play, we brought him back into the story, and it was huge and it was epic. I mean, it was this really like celebratory moment when he came back, and like right at a time that the party most needed them, right? And it was that's not being afraid to let go of the reins a little bit,
right?
And you just trust yourself and your player to get you there. And we did, and it's one of my favorite TTRPG moments that like still is like top shelf experience for me. That session was huge, like people shouting and everything they're talking about in the chat. But yeah, he came in on the back of a frost giant to stop a bunch of fire giants who had encircled the rest of the party in fire. Like nice. they were doomed, and he comes riding in on the back of this friendly frost giant. It was so awesome. But you can find ways to make it work.
Right.
I think Game of Thrones ripped that scene off, but they added dragons.
Yeah, Game of Thrones. They didn't get the right writers. Bastards. They should have called us. Yeah.
Well, I think like I kind of mentioned earlier, we're all to an extent on an agreement here. When you're talking about railroading and this is what I said early on, I don't think railroading versus player agency isn't quite exactly what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is, having the frame of a story and, coloring in the canvas with your table, so to speak, right?
Mhm.
With this particular frame. And I think we all agree to that pretty heartily.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely
for
the
sure.
best story comes out when you have as a GM, you have your story going, but then you pick up on an idea that a player has and you can meld the two ideas together into a better idea. And that's where the magic happens, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we may have come to a happy place. We're 40 minutes in right now.
Mhm.
Usually I get the feeling of, oh, this has been a good discussion. We should bring in player questions, but usually that's
Listen,
20 minutes from now.
well, but we have a new segment that we can do for 20
Oh,
minutes,
that's
don't we?
right.
Sure.
Well pointed out, Adam.
Yeah.
Player advice. What maybe have we done as players?
I have a good bit of player advice.
For
Yeah, so
doing this? Yeah,
advice
go ahead.
to players about the nature of railroading. Is that what we're going to do here?
Well,
Yeah, or how to enact your agency, or
Yeah,
how
that's
to
what I- that's
balance
where I
your
was going with it.
agency with what you see the GM has going for you.
All right. Well, Griffin, you got something.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're a player and you want to have agency, be very clear at the end of each session where you as a group want to go. You're making your GM's life so much easier, and your GM is 100% going to back giving you that agency when they have the time to prep it. If you go mid-session and you're like, I want to completely go off the rails here, you're less likely to get a yes than if it's like the GM winds down the session and you're at a point where you have a choice and you decide you want to go do this other thing. That's so much cooler as a person for you to do. Your GM's only human.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree. Like, if you have an idea, yeah, just work with your GM. That's the first piece of advice that I would get, is that players say yes and to your GM too. Like there is like a certain notion of that the GM is kind of the common enemy that the players band together around, and that's a dynamic that I think does have a place at a table, but it shouldn't devolve to GM versus PCs, because that's not really productive. And the GM is a player too, and the GM is trying to make sure that you guys are having a good time. So join in with the GM and say yes and to the GM. Don't be antagonistic to the GM in a story sense. You can talk shit to us all day long. We expect that. We're that's fine. But it's when it comes down to like story stuff, to just put up a hard resistance just for the sake of being a edgelord or murder hobo or whatever other terrible bad name for players there are. And think about how can you make the story bigger together,
Yeah.
and
like
that
the
is your
hook.
agency. That is your agency, right? That is your agency to put your imprint on the story by saying yes to the story and saying, all right, I'm in this story and this is how my character is going to leave their mark, and that's important.
Yeah, it's definitely a nice thing for a GM when you see a player that they hit the hook hard when you're reeling them in, and while you're reeling them in, they tell you, hey, I'm really invested in this because of something else that's like more character driven than the plot driven. Like, I really fucking hate that guy at the end because he did this to me, and so I'm more into it to take that guy out, or I know that they have something, blah, 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 other reasons. But yeah.
And I think as a GM and a player, you should be working together. We talk about session one all the time, but I think especially running an adventure path, you kind of know the beats. And if you can get backstories that at least help sink the hook later on, it's going to be a lot easier to get at least part of the party's buy-in to follow the main story.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take an example. I'm playing in Return of the Rune Lords, and at some point you do go to the Shadow Plane, and my character's whole backstory, I introduced him in book 2, is involved with the Shadow Plane and that kind of thing. And so when that came up, it wasn't like hey guys, you're going on a weird detour to the shadow plane. It was like, fuck yeah, my character really wants to go there because of all of these other things in his backstory. And I think that's a good way to create buy-in and work with each other, is to just work your backstory
Yeah.
in with
Yeah.
the GM. GMs are happy to do that shit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I like
they want that, you know.
Yeah, and I
Have-
like as a player to kind of give an open-ended backstory where
Oh,
you don't
yes.
fill in the specific details. You're like, yeah, I was from a church. They kicked me out. I had a run-in with some dude who trained me for a while, but then ended up being an asshole. If you just kind of leave those details sparse and like not specific, there's probably going to be a plot-related NPC that the GM could make that person for you.
Well, like, yeah,
That's kind of
that's
balance, and that's not really agency, but that's kind of like as a player giving balance, like
don't
giving
take
them balance. But
yeah, don't take agency away from yourself by writing such a detailed backstory that you have no place in the story. Like, understand that the most exciting part of your character's life should be the adventure that you're playing, right? Like,
Mhm.
you shouldn't have like this huge epic backstory that is the best part of your life and then go from level 1 to 20. That's the level 1 to 20 in the story that you're playing, the adventure you're playing should be like the tale of your lifetime, right? And so the background is to inform how you react to those decisions, and the more openness you leave in that, the more agency you can have as it comes down the line, and you get a better sense of what the plot is, to say, oh well, you know, actually when I was from this town, I actually met this dude who I didn't know existed when we started on session 1, but we went to this town that I'm from, and this guy's from that town. Hey, I can know that person. GM, how can we work that out? You know, but if you've written this big backstory that's like sequestered you into some monkhood at that town and you didn't see anybody, well, now you don't have that option, right? And
Mhm.
so leave yourself space for the story to inform the past just as much as your backstory informs the present.
Yes, agreed.
And you know, one thing that I think is fun to do is kind of do and Adam sort of mentioned it to a degree. You know, hey, I didn't realize about this person back when I made the character or wrote my backstory, but I would know this guy. It's okay if you start a conversation with your GM that involves, hey, this thing happened last session. I want to tie that back to a backstory piece that I haven't written, but I think would be cool and would inform my character's decision on what we're doing right now. You know,
100%.
I mean, as a player, or at least as a GM, from my perspective, I would not mind that at all.
Mhm.
You know,
I think that ties into some chatter that we have going on in the chat here. And is it basically the crux of what they're talking about is it kosher to plan events with your GM as a player, or should everything just kind of happen as a surprise? Like, how does, if you have this idea of what you want your character to do in the future, you know, how do you go about that as a player to approaching your GM? Maybe advice in that?
Oh, I think you should just this seems weird to say, but I would hope you have that level of trust in your GM to be able to go to them.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I can't think of a reason why I would ever.
well, so
I'm just like, why would
I'm
I
not
ever
sure if
say
it's
no here?
right.
This is
So
awesome.
I'm not sure it's a
Oh.
trust thing, more so as a like, hey, we're not supposed to know what's going to happen, you know? So if we plan, you know, going back to the railroad thing, am I railroading you as a player by saying, I want my character to do this you know, this is what I want to happen for my character 4 episodes from now, or 4 sessions from now, or whatever.
Well,
Certainly, does
there's
that go against the nature of letting the present tell the story? And I think no.
well, and I think it
I
depends.
think it's
Like,
fine.
what it depends on the ask, right? And if you're going to ask to control the outcome of things to come, that's just I'm sorry, I'm not going to allow a player to control the way that a story beat will play out just because they
Mhm.
want it to happen that way.
Mhm.
The way I would prefer to receive that conversation would be hey, these are my character's ambitions right now, and as a GM, you want to take those desires, those ambitions, and find a way for them to either come to fruition or build them up and break them down based on those ambitions to depending on the type of player, right? You know, for story reasons.
I agree. I
But
agree
yeah.
with that. I agree with that take, Tyler. But I'll amend it a little different in that. Yeah, if a player says, "Hey, I wanna, I don't know, be the badass at the end of this book, and I want to like be set up, and I just want to jump on top of the boss and break his head off. That's what I'm going to do." Well, no, that's not what you're going to do.
The dice tell that story. You don't. Yeah.
Right. But so if somebody comes up with an idea that they want to do, let's say, I'm trying to think of an example here. If I want my character to go from a fighter to a paladin, okay, and I want my character to go through this style of transformation to get there, right? But like I'm anticipating that he goes and he fights this dude and he gets killed and he gets reborn as a paladin. Okay. When I first started, I will say that's an example from an old game to where we charted that out and made it happen. What I would do now is I would create opportunities for that to happen, right? And then play it out to see if it does happen, right? So maybe when you get to that fight, you die, but you die in such a way that you can't come back as a paladin, like you were like eviscerated or whatever, or some of the choices that you made along the way changed your ability to be a champion of whatever cause you were going to do. So I'm much more inclined to say, okay, I like that story idea. Let's set that as a goal or a target for your PC, but I'm not guaranteeing anything. I'm just going to try to create a situation where you have that opportunity, and I think it's absolutely, I would say anybody that the advice I would give if I were GMing you as a player about those things is definitely talk to me about what you want. You know what I mean? Don't be afraid to come to me and say, here's an idea that I have for my character. Here's an idea that that I would really like to see my character do. And depending on what it is, I think most GMs will talk you through it and try to figure out a way to do it without just saying, here's the keys to the castle. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and even like as a player, if you have, big broad stroke, I want to be the badass at the end of the campaign, or I want to be the king of the world, or like I said, broad strokes, I want to feel good about, my character, right? I think if you have a goal, then the GM can then present opportunities to you, and pardon my adversarial tone, but to shit test your conviction on that place that you want your player or your character to be. Because it's not, sometimes these things will happen, but if you're not playing your character to where it's going to go down that path or take those opportunities that have been presented to you, right? Especially if the time has been taken to go through all of those opportunities, or however you want to deem it based on the situation. If it doesn't happen the way you wanted it to based on a previous conversation you had with the GM, that's okay too. Then maybe,
or hot take, don't go to your GM for something stupid like I want to be a badass.
Also,
play your character like they're a badass.
Right. That was a bad. That's
player agency. Just do that. You're the player. Go to them if you like want an alignment change, or if you want or a major turning point in your character. I'm sure your GM will work with you for it. Don't go to them with silly shit like I want to be the one that kills the boss. That's not how the game works.
Yeah. Right.
You're a player.
And
you know how the game works.
That was a bad example, and I think most people even know that inherently, that it's like, you can't just go and be like, I want to be the one that wins. Like it's more so, that kind of this scripted big scene moment, whether it's like, all right, before we go into the boss fight, I want to give a big speech to the party. Can you make sure that there's like enough pause in your description before we go for me to take that opportunity? Talk to your GM. Otherwise that won't happen. That's you know perfect, what I mean? Right. Like, or it's like, okay, I was looking through these rules and I think that this is something that I want to do in the future, but I want to get some clarification ahead of time. Talk to your GM, do it. Like those are the types of things, that is absolutely what a GM wants to hear. And I ask my players all the time, what do you see for your characters in the future? What is a story? What is a theme that you want to explore with your character? Do you want to feel lost? Do you want to explore pain? Do you want to explore what it means to be a hero? And we talk about these kind of more conceptual ideas, and I get a feel of what kind of looks like a winning end goal for them in that theme. And I try to set up enough challenges along for the way for them to earn that and get it, So I think always talk to your GM, and it's not this awful sin to like plan a couple beats out ahead of time at all.
No.
Like, especially if it has going to have this big impact on the rest of the table. The GM is not the only storyteller at the table. And if somebody's got a good story idea that we could work towards, then by all means, let's discuss it and see if that's something that we can do within the story.
Right.
What I also want to say is you should be upfront with your I think this is kind of a part of the session 0 thing again, but like, especially at a more casual table, if you can be, you and your GM can be okay with the fact that you can like raise your hand and like say, hey, can you and I step out of the room for 5 minutes during a session so I could talk to you about something? I mean, sometimes these ideas don't even come to us months ahead of time. The big speech you're talking about could happen like as you guys are preparing for this combat around the campfire, and like it's like your GM's just about to roll into it. If you have that agreement ahead of time that you could just raise your hand and be like, hey, can you and me like hop into the other room and talk about something real quick? That makes it so much smoother for everybody. And I think that's like, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but that's when I'm a player, that's how half of my like, oh, I want to have a character moment here. That's how half of it happens. The other half I'll like think about flashbacks or whatever, or talk to another player or something. But the other half, I'm like, I really want something badass to happen right here. I mean, Adam, I fell out of like a 5th story window and you just kind of had to roll with it because you and I are playing that game.
Right.
But at a table where your GM's going to try and roll into something, it's like, especially at my table, feel free to interrupt me. Like, feel free to interrupt me for a second. Don't do it all the time, but if you have a big character moment that you want to like express, I know that happens sometimes on the fly.
I mean, you guys have heard it on the show. Heath will be like, okay, I was letting y'all talk, but can we go back? Cause I had something for this, he'll do it, like just take your own agency. Don't wait for the GM to give it to you.
Yeah.
You have it.
Yeah, because I'm not going to stop, right? Unless you tell me to.
Don't wait for your GM to give it to you. I like that.
I wouldn't say that we are apt to map out or like script scenes in the future, but I will definitely take your idea and like bring and place it in when there is a spot similar to what you wanted to do happening. And it's hard to like plan out exact things, but telling what you want to your GM so they just have the inkling of when they have an opportunity to present you with these challenges. And to quote Morgan Freeman from Evan Almighty as God, when you ask God to for your family to get closer together, does he zap you with warm, happy feelings, or does he present you the opportunity to do something together? Boom. Not that I'm super religious. I just thought that was a funny thing that.
No, I like it. Yeah, I think this can very. I like when it comes down to this, the player side of it, of this conversation, communication.
Wait, what?
I mean,
like all good relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Like all good relationships. Hell, I mean, don't even be afraid to just after a session to shoot your GM a message that said, I like this. This is how my character's feeling about it. You don't even have to ask for anything. Just let them know how they feel, right?
Right.
And because otherwise we're going to ask you all the time how your characters are feeling, which, we're probably going to do anyways. But just tell them after a session. When it's fresh in your head, shoot them a quick text or something. That's always a good way to communicate.
I don't know if this is going to come as a shock to any of you, but I think all GMs like to hear their players talk about the game.
Yeah.
Like it's what we're want, it's what we're feeding off of. So like, do not ever think that you shouldn't talk to your GM. And if a GM doesn't want to hear what you have to say, find another GM. Seriously.
New game.
New game.
Yeah.
Well, I think now would be a great time for us to go grab another drink and take a quick break. We'll see you guys back here in 10 minutes for the last half and listener questions.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second half of the Game Master Happy Hour. Before we get on to listener questions, I just want to take a minute and say, if you're joining us from YouTube, hey,
So
nice to see you.
Hey, YouTubers.
But I've got links to all of the Discords down at the bottom. Come and hang out with us in our Discords. We absolutely love talking with listeners. And if you're not listeners, we're all Paizoverse podcasters. So come check us out.
We are. It's true. That's what we do.
That's what we do. So
and we do different things than the AP, as you've heard throughout these episodes.
Yeah.
So
We make them our own.
Yeah, it's not going to be the same as what you've experienced if you've ran these ones. So check it out.
Well, nobody's run Second Darkness. You don't have
Yeah,
to
you're
worry
the
about
only
Right.
person ever
Second
to.
Darkness, get at it. Nobody wants to play it. Nobody will, but we're doing it.
So I want to real quick just say something about where before we ended, because something came to me on our break. One of the times where it's kind of a GM afterthought to the player advice section, which was
GM afterthought.
yeah, there you go.
So
One
you just
time,
blew it.
no, I know, yeah, totally. No, one time I had a player ask me a question that was game altering, right? Something that they wanted for their player or for their character, and without getting into any specific details, I said yes, and then we move forward. But saying yes was too much of an ask, and it completely had a big effect on the rest of the players at my table. So kind of this was my however moment. Sometimes yes and isn't always the right answer. Most of the time it is.
Boo.
Yeah.
Most of the time it is, right?
Yeah, I didn't even think about like what somebody wants to do could get in the way of the other players.
Yeah,
Exactly.
No, there's
That's
there's
definitely a balance to consider as well.
Exactly.
Hey, GM, my character really wants to kill this other character.
Yeah, I hate that piece of shit. They called me dumb the other day. Mm-mm.
No,
You let me do
you're right.
PvP?
It's easy to take for granted sometimes when you have a group that you've been playing with for a long time that yes and is not going to be abused. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
there's definitely potential, and even without intent to abuse that when you're starting with a new group of players. So if you're a new table feeling each other out, you have to find out where that balance is for that particular table. I mean, there's a difference between that balance and hideous tomfoolery and southern tomfoolery, just because of having two different players there than normal. It's a good balance. Obviously, we enjoyed doing it, but there's a different threshold of yes and for that game than there is for southern tomfoolery. So I will say I'll retract my boo. That you have a point, Tyler.
Yeah. Creating measured responses is the best way to go about that whole
Appropriate.
process. Yes.
Or maybe if
Boo.
this idea affects another player, maybe it'll be fun to like get them in on this idea too, and then maybe two of the party are in on something.
What
cool.
a novel
Little one.
concept, a three-way.
What a novel concept is well, yeah. It works out so well
Oh,
for some
man.
reason.
I have another story that I want to tell at some point tonight that has to do with player agencies and the GM, but I know we got listener questions. So
I
let's-
thought I got your gears turning on the three-way. I was
Here-
like,
here-
No.
save that for the after hours.
So
I was gonna say
After
that,
party, right?
for the YouTube folks, if you get on the Discord, you get to be part of the after hours portion of this that's not recorded. Just saying. That's
Because
where a lot of
legally
the
allowed
juice
to
is.
be.
Yep.
Yeah,
Tyler will
yeah.
talk all about his 3 ways.
You ready to do some listener questions?
Some
y'all?
letter Kennies?
Some letter Kenny questions?
Yeah.
Let's do some listener questions. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Well, let's start with Swanee.
All right.
You know,
He's a good
he's got
guy.
home field advantage here.
Yeah,
So
he
we're gonna
does.
start.
Yeah, he does.
We'll start with Swanee. Why does my GM always railroad my party? He is kind of an ass about. I'm just reading it here. He's kind of an ass about it. Like, you have to be part of the circus and such. Oh, just kidding. Real question is, how do you give player agency while playing an AP, which I think we kind of covered in the first section. Do you have like a quick answer of what you did specifically for this? How did you get around? What did you do to get around the why are you asking us question? Because I know it came up.
Oh, it came up a lot.
Right.
And a lot of it comes down to, you know, the people are going to react the way that they're going to react, but sometimes the story demands that the players be asked, even if they are fools. Doesn't mean they have to say yes to the question, but
That's true. That's true. But they will, because they love you truly.
they really do.
They just like to give you a hard time. Okay, this next question comes from FL. They ask, what do you think is a good balance between player agency and railroading, maintaining story integrity, especially in pre-written content? Do you prefer to lean more one way or the other? And again, a lot of these questions are going to be kind of shades of what we've already discussed. So what I'm going to try to do is help us focus in some direct answers on this. So in pre-written content, is there a line that you won't get? Is there too far away from the AP? Does that line exist for you? Let's start with Allard.
For my case in specific, because I don't have all my experiences recording being a GM for a podcast. So I've probably mentioned this to my players. If they do ever feel like their characters are at a point where their goals don't align with the stories anymore, I will allow them to bow out and create another character. And because we are a content provider, maybe we'll touch back on what those characters are doing.
Okay, good. That was a very good, concise, and clear answer. I'm proud of you, Allard.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to keep it going, and we're going to go to Griffin next.
Yeah, I think Tyler made the point earlier on if we'd ever not finished an AP because the players' decisions went too far away from the story. I think this is the exact scenario where that happens. If you go too far, hey, this kind of leads into Shattered Star. Let's play that then. If that's what you're interested in.
Right?
Like let's go down that road. If you're really interested in something completely different, either I'm going to homebrew you a track and we're going to try and get back, or if you're telling me I'm not interested in the story we're playing, then I'm going to homebrew a ramp from this story to one that we are more interested in.
Would you ever just say, all right, we tried this campaign, this story, we don't like it, let's just cut bait and start one that we like, rather than trying to even morph it into one?
Not for a podcast, definitely.
Well, not for a podcast.
No,
definitely for a table. I think that's the easiest way to do it.
Yeah. I mean, at the table, it depends on how married the players are to their characters. If they don't like the story but love their characters, maybe just like Griff suggested, pick them up and drop them in a different AP. Or if they don't like their characters, start a new AP.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's your free time. Have fun with it.
Yeah, fuck. Don't spend your free time playing something you don't like to play.
Right.
Exactly.
But if you had a good session 0, you should hopefully like to play the adventure that you're playing.
Yeah, and I think one of my players, Kyle, who plays Crowed Moonwave, the half orc kind of like, he was a piratey out on the sea guy. He asked me what would happen if we ever just like got on a boat and left, and I was like, well, I guess we're playing Skulls and Shackles.
Yeah, I guess we're gonna start Skulls and Shackles.
Yeah.
There you go.
I definitely have a limit of how far we can get away, but again, to Allard's point, that's because we do a podcast, and so we are committed to a particular story here. You know, I want to push the edges of that as much as I can, you know, but we're still going to do a horror podcast for our second campaign, and we're still going to, you know, follow the tracks that go to these various stages because we want to, you know, we're into it. So what about you, Tyler?
I think most of the time for us, we are of this story isn't terribly interesting to us. Let's do a different story, except for new characters because we love making characters, right? So, I mean, like, that's just kind of how my table plays. So, again, off podcast. For this is kind of, you know, we've all made a commitment to finish this, right? For ourselves and for our listeners. But at home, we just would play campaigns until we were satisfied with what we were doing and then played through that.
Yeah, I think the subbing into another AP is something I would do more on a podcast because I'd be like, well, your characters are the draw to this show. So like you got to keep your characters. What do we want to slide into if you guys aren't feeling it 2 years down the line?
Right.
Yeah,
You know
right,
what?
right.
Book 5 just doesn't seem very fun to me.
You know, if you guys have like just 17 fire giant combats in a row and want to jump ship, I don't blame you, I guess.
That does sound a little dull.
Yeah, there's a lot of other good book 6s out there, you know. Okay, so this next question comes from Jason, a regular there on the MinMax server.
Jason K, what's up, man?
Yeah, thanks for joining us this evening. Jason Laptop, as he is now.
Oh, no, laptop.
Yeah. So how do you all deal with players seeing behind the curtain? And he gives an example here. This happened last session where a player asked an NPC a question and the player noticed me being put on the spot and pausing to think of a response. Afterwards, they joked, well, clearly that's not the way to go. And I know that this has happened to all of us at some point in our GMing careers where you kind of give something away about the foundations of the game because they put you in a spot where you don't have a quick, ready answer. You know,
the trick is never be quick.
Always
be really slow.
Think about it.
Whatever it is, just
so this is why
it.
y'all are a drunk podcast.
Yeah, ponder it.
Wow, it all makes sense now. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because you want to, as a GM, and maybe this is just my tendency, to be prepared for all possibilities when it comes to how your party's going to approach what's being put forward them in any, you know, given night. But my guys joke at me all the time, like, I have no poker face. I'm so bad at it. And it goes down to, like, they can tell when we were still playing in person, they could tell when I was just rolling dice behind the screen to roll dice behind the screen because I have no poker face. Now, to my response to that is, it doesn't have to be, you know, you don't know. Maybe take some time when you do know and react to that particular interaction as opposed to the story itself. And what I mean by that is, how would your NPC respond off of the book's script? You know, take some time to respond with that, and maybe the next time it happens where you don't have an answer and you take a pause, it's not projected as, oh, I don't know what to say here, right?
Jason, just pretend like you're choking and buy yourself some time.
Roll me a diplomacy check.
Sorry, I'm trying to do this voice and it's really fucking my throat up. Buy yourself some time.
Sense motive. He's being suspicious.
Yeah, so that's happened to me a lot because for me to do certain character voices, I have to put on a particular face. Like, I have to contort my face in a way to get them. And so I've had a lot of my players immediately not trust an NPC because they're seeing Adam contort his face in a weird way, you know? And I'm like, okay, I totally don't trust this dude because I'm making this face like this, like, hey, trust me, you know, like, you know, like,
No,
talking about
Pass.
So, you know, that's just a challenge that comes up, Jason. And I think, you know, you have to have some conversations with your players and, You know, sometimes they'll try to push that a little bit, and I'm not afraid to be like, okay, though, but would your character really know that? You know, like you kind of check it out a little bit on the table.
But I really want to
sometimes.
make a sense motive check right now, Adam.
Okay,
Just let me
Go
make
for
that
it.
check.
hold on. Let me roll my bluff
What's your
or my
what's your modifier?
diplomacy.
You can't roll that one. I'm rolling that one for you. What's your modifier?
Yeah, it's a secret check.
There you
Secret
go.
check.
There you go.
I hope that answers your question somewhat. But it's a good question. I like it. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah.
So the next question. Okay. All right. Jay Pickle, you get this question because you included an example. Because I was about to go past it because I feel like we've already talked about it, but the example specifies what we're getting at here. So this question from Jay Pickle: what are your personal opinions on utilizing the illusion of choice? And I was going to skip that because that's what we just talked about for 40 minutes, but we have a good example here that I'm curious in how you would respond to. Your players, you ask them whether they go up or down the river. No matter what they choose, they encounter the broken bridge.
Yeah, this is the classic illusion of
Yeah.
choice example. I mean, it's for a podcast. It's better not to waste time down something that you have no idea that there's nothing down there than to have them backpedal. But
Especially if it's downriver versus upriver. That's going to
Yeah,
take all episode, man.
exactly. It's gonna take so long.
I make another paddle check.
One more.
I would argue even outside of a podcast, if it's not fun to do,
True.
don't do it. Like,
Yeah.
like if going south goes to nowhere, and like you're basically all right. So let me get that survival check to make sure you don't get lost. Okay, you got down there. Now do a perception. I rolled a 17, so that's like middling. So you're like, you don't see anything, and they're like, did I not see anything? Was there something I missed? I don't know. I rolled a 17. Like, and then they just leave to go back up to where the encounter was anyways. Like, I don't personally enjoy that as a player or even doing that as a GM, you know? So I would just say, yeah, you got to the thing that's next, you know what I mean? While still giving them, that's that trick of the illusion of choice of not showing the rails, you know?
Right.
Like, all right, you're giving them a choice. Gosh, this is really behind the curtain, but you're giving them a choice that doesn't matter what they choose.
It's a
They still get to
rhetorical
choose,
choice.
but they still get to choose. You know what I mean? Like, they still get to take some ownership in what their characters are doing, you know?
Or is it
And that's why it has to remain behind a GM screen, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's the purpose of having the curtain there, is to help with that suspension of disbelief, you know?
Yeah. Is it fun to kind of like, well, not fun, but story pointish or character development oriented if you be like, just kind of quickly, oh, you guys go down that way a little bit. It doesn't look like that's the way to go. So you double back. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. I think that's a great way to handle it. Like, if they make a choice that doesn't go anywhere or doesn't have any consequence, then you can quickly narrate it that way to say, okay, I'm not going to invalidate your choice. You went a direction that went nowhere. I'm not going to spend game time and mechanics times rolling that out.
Right.
Right.
You went to the edge of the map. Good job.
And if
You mean you
anything-
guys don't run your games like they're JRPGs and every dead end has some loot at the end of it?
No.
Amateurs. Amateurs.
Amateurs. That's where you put the best loot.
That's where you
dude.
put the best loot. You went south? Yeah, that's where the +1 breastplate is. You go north? Only combat in that direction.
So, you know, and it's funny because there are lots of examples of Pickle's example. If they were supposed to go talk to somebody, but they just never did, maybe that person goes and finds them instead. It can go beyond going north or south on the river. It can be those interactions that are, you know, manufactured in the AP, manufacture it some other way, some way that
or
they really can't
maybe
tell the difference.
Maybe the NPC that they ended up talking to kind of knows about this, but they have a slightly different perspective on it, or they maybe like they heard about it, so like the information is a little jumbled, but that just ends up being surprising when they actually get to the thing, and it's a little bit different. They didn't prepare for it quite enough.
I heard the NPC you're supposed to talk to has that information.
Yeah, but you can't come at them with that voice because then they're going to want to talk to that NPC. Oh, now we're talking to this guy.
I know a great many things. Search inside my crystal ball.
What? Just behind
I
this
think
curtain.
you should go south for the loot.
Yes, I heard there was a great cache just down the river.
That'll be 20 rupees.
Yeah. If you're looking for that headband,
You won't
that's where
level
it's
up
at.
unless you go south.
This is shit you only find out if you read the guide, the IGN guide.
Hold on.
Sorry, you haven't gone on Wiki FAQ?
Why not?
Game FAQs?
All right, next question. Here we go. This is from David. Lots of min-maxed questions tonight, and I like it. We're on the min-max server, so way to represent min-max team.
Yeah.
From David, if your players do something really stupid that should get them killed, do you let them die or try to make it work? I'm pretty sure I know the answer to all of us here, but we'll start with you, Tyler.
Let them die.
Yeah. Allard? He can't answer because his players are listening and he hasn't killed one of his players yet.
Yeah.
I have kind of run into those where I was like, that was not the wisest decision to go in there alone. But instead of directly killing them, I took something else away that was more impactful for that character than it would have been for the player to be like, all right, now I have to make a new PC. Having somebody survive with repercussions is almost better than killing them sometimes.
Yeah, I ascribe to the let them die or make it worse philosophy.
There you go. Yeah, I like that.
If the situation was exceedingly dire, then yeah, I have had an occasion where if things would have gone exactly how I wanted them to, there could have been a player death within the first round of combat. But they don't do those things quite like you plan for those things. But I like to. My one example comes very early on in book one, so I wasn't just gonna kill a character straight out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I say let him die. That's my answer there. So next question. Okay, this is another one from Jason. Jason Laptop. Another question for the GM Happy Hour show. How much does playing time, like the amount of time you have allotted for a session, affect railroading? And I think that's a really good question because we didn't talk about that at all. And sometimes that really does affect particularly like the last 30 minutes of a session. I think there's a tendency for railroading to hit the hardest towards the end of a session. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
I think it's really hard to allow player choice and prep for like an 8-hour session. Unless you're going to do these fake out choices type things. But if you're really going to go whole hog and let them hey, we want to do this like circuitous route to get here. And we want to try this method, which is completely off the wall to accomplish this objective. Unless you got a really firm grasp on what you've prepped and how you can diverge from that, and you got a really firm grasp on everything you can pull in to make that work, I think a really long session, it's really difficult. I'll just put that out there. We run this in 2-hour blocks, and that's fucking easy. That's easy mode. Run all your sessions in 2-hour blocks.
Yeah,
super easy.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's 2 to 3 hours. I think is a good time to run a session because then you can really experience it. You know what I mean? I think 4 hours and over is sometimes pushing it. You
Mhm.
know, like you're asking a lot from there's certain tables where that's like their bread and butter, right? Like long, once a month we get together for the weekend and we just play hard and all weekend, and like there's nothing wrong with that. But like if you're playing every week and trying to play 5 hours every week with the same game, I feel like that's overexposure to that particular campaign, and it's those last 2 hours of every session are going to be weaker than the first 3 hours, guaranteed.
Yeah, like what
Yeah.
I've noticed for doing anything creative or job oriented, after like 4 hours of going like focusing on it, it's hard to have the same steam you did after those 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm
but
coming
it can be
fresh off
done.
of a like 7-hour recording session though, and I
But
will
that was
say you'll never get your players to play their characters better than when you have
but
a long ass session like that.
but that was for what, Evil Interludes, right?
I'll never tell.
I'll never
Well,
tell.
my point is that that's something that if it is for that, that it's not something you're doing every week, right? So there's a extra level of excitement
Absolutely,
that propels
yeah.
you through a long session like that.
And
You
did
know?
you guys have breaks in there too?
No,
I don't
pee
think
breaks,
anybody
they run
does
catheters.
breaks in their 8-hour sessions, bro.
See,
IVs and
that
catheters.
helps. Like
Sorry.
I recently had a 5.5 hour session that we had 2 breaks in, and it wasn't that bad, So I think the breaks really help keep everybody, like when you have a break time, you can think about what just happened and how you're going to address it moving forward. And it kind of depends on your table, I guess, again.
Yeah. You're gonna get food. You're gonna talk about it. You're gonna spend half an hour eating dinner.
Mm.
All right. Well, we got a lot of questions to go through, so we're gonna
Answer
keep
a
it
lightning
moving.
round.
We're far from the lightning round, but
Right.
that's okay. We still got an easy 30 minutes here, if not more. Okay, how's this? From Jay Pickle. What's the worst experience you've had being railroaded as a player? What about the worst experience railroading as a GM?
My worst experiences railroading as a GM kind of happen at the beginning of some sessions where it's like we start off right after combat is ended, and like, what do you guys like? Reorient yourself right now and tell me what you guys are going to do. Sometimes in those moments, it's better to remind them and tell them what their objective is rather than have them spend 30 minutes kind of stumbling over remembering what they were supposed to do or something like that. And in other situations, I've had NPCs that are kind of leader kind of people that have directed those moments. And those are kind of moments that I feel a little bit bad for kind of railroading how things begin. But sometimes that's just what you need in order to like fill out the rest of the session to really like kickstart the rest of it.
All right. Anybody else have any thoughts on that one?
I have a. Go ahead.
Well, I guess so. For me, I was going to say my worst moment as a GM railroading was railroading for a player against my other players. That was that bad accident that I alluded to earlier on. Like I made a bad decision there. Yeah, that's the only one I really have.
Yeah, I think my most egregious, and it's not something I regret at all, but like incorporating the corruption mechanic into my campaign definitely is I can throw it on you whenever, and I can take your player agency away whenever.
Yeah,
And that's like,
But
you know,
is that your
that's-
worst or your best experience as a GM railroad?
I mean, it's my most egregious.
I suppose
which-
egregious would
which
be the way to
is
say
another way to say worse, I guess.
Yeah.
You ever
yeah.
not told a character they're on a corruption path?
I didn't tell, minor spoilers, I didn't tell Ikmer for like a book that he was already on the werewolf corruption track.
You didn't realize by that point?
I mean, when I was like, oh, mid combat, you grow claws and fangs,
That's when he
picked it up.
No, he picked it up like 5 weeks later, but he got it. He
I
got
think
it.
in book 1, I was like, you wake up naked covered in blood. It was just a full moon. I'm probably fine.
Yeah, I guess I drank too much. You know.
Because I drank too much.
I shouldn't have started drinking that beer.
I will say that I I almost don't want to say mine because I don't want to like call out a good buddy of mine because
GM call out hashtag.
it is like a player / GM call out. All right, so Zach ran us through Curse of Strahd, and I want to say first and foremost, I loved that campaign. Like, if there's any reason to play 5e, it's to play that campaign. Like, I will speak high praise, and Zach did a fantastic job with it. But he was a first-time GM at that time, and this was the first time I actually played a character. So I was you know how we GMs can get when we switch into player characters for the first time, right? We can be difficult, you know. At least I was.
Depends on the type of GM. There's the backseat GM.
But there was a couple moments throughout that campaign where I really felt like my agency was stripped away, and one of it was because of the campaign, and it was me resisting really, really hard against the story and and I knew that, and I was just being an ass about it, you know. Like, I was making it very difficult on Zach. We were running a section of the book that he wasn't particularly fond of, but it had to happen. It was like a really crucial story moment, but the area itself, it's just not, it wasn't anything that any of us wanted to do, but we had to do it, you know. And I resisted it bad, and so like, I was a dick there. But then there was another instance where I had made a choice that was really important to my character, and it was negating a whole system of loot that Zach had created, and it was this really like beautiful Diablo style loot system, right? Like, he wanted to run a game where we were like decked out. He was going to throw challenging encounters at us, but he wanted loot to be much more prevalent than it typically is in 5e, because in 5e loot is not prevalent, you know. Like, you can play levels 1 to 15 and get 3 magic items throughout that whole thing.
Well, they're not balanced very well. That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole nother deal. So but he wanted to have a very fun kind of loot based kind of Gothic dungeon campaign. I mean, he's a big fan of Dark Souls. He loves the Diablo stuff too, and like, that's what he wanted to do, and it was awesome. And he made individual homebrewed like loot tables for us when we completed a big encounter, and it would drop from the sky. This chest would drop, and it would be like it would be like something so perfect for our characters, you know. Like, I was playing a ranger, and he would drop these badass archer gloves that made me so good at the thing that I really liked doing. Well, there was a moment there where we found out that it was coming from the big bad, and so I, in character, was like, I'm shedding all of this. I'm getting rid of it, you know. I can't wear this.
Fuck these gloves.
I burned it. Burned it. And that was
we can't use it.
I think that was and Zach, I know you're listening. I'm sorry, buddy, but I think this is a good story. It was a learning process for both of us, because like, he immediately gave me back all of those things a couple sessions later, but it was from like a new god, and like, everybody got new upgraded like paladin versions of the stuff that we had. And so I felt like my choice to like shed all of my power in the face of evil didn't have like the weight that I wanted it to. So that might have caused me to be an asshole to him later when we went to this city that I was talking about being an asshole at. Because, you know.
Okay, well, hold on real quick. I got to interject here. Zach, I feel you. The unintended consequences of being a nice GM are sometimes real, right? Like, you're trying to give them something to, you know, like, this is for you. I handpicked this for you. And I can only imagine Zach's face when he was like, you're burning it? Those gloves were for you.
He couldn't understand it. Like, because that's just, we play games differently. You know what I mean? Like, very differently. And we learned a lot about each other in that Curse of Strahd game. And like, you know, it really like gelled our friendship, I think, on a whole new level, which is again another topic about the power of TTRPGs and what they can do for your relationships. But
For real.
you know, like we really, like, I think for the first time understood each other's perspectives on why each other plays the game. You know what I mean? Because it came to such a head at the table. It's like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, you want to have like the best loot that suits your character, and that's how Zach plays. And like, I now have an understanding of that as a GM to help make better games for Zach, you know? And he understands that I want struggle as a player. I give you shit all the time, Tyler, for, you know, being suicidal with your characters, but like, I get it to some degree because I want the struggle, you know?
Yeah.
And that was it was such a learning experience that it's hard to call it my worst experience of being railroaded, because it improved the dynamic of our table on such a grand level.
It sounds like this was the most memorable experience because it had a very personal effect on you and your relationship with Zach.
Right.
Worst in terms of causing the biggest blow up.
Yeah. All right. Well, another great discussion started there, Jay Pickle. Appreciate it.
Way to go, Pickle.
Okay, so Gold Reno asked a question that we might have already answered it, but I'm curious if you guys think so. What do you do when a character's backstory motivation is leading them in a different direction than what is laid out in the AP? I mean, we basically said what we would do in that case, right? We either run them in a separate thing or retire the character. And I mean, is there anything new to add to that specifically?
Consider the possibility of constraining yourself while still going towards that goal. I'm, I think, a big proponent of creativity within constraints, right? If you want to go in a particular direction and it's way off the rails from where the party is going or where the story is going, try to write that personality into the story. And if it fails, you know, have them book off on a side quest and bring in another character. But consider that you might get a better story for somebody that isn't where they're supposed to be, but you make it work as a player.
The main arcs of any character is all about how they change. So maybe you take it as a GM, this is what I have to see if this person will change about themselves to overcome the hurdle to be in this story like they need to be. Or if they don't, they have a different story. If they overcome or change themselves to fit this path, then that is their story of how they grew and changed in order to be what they needed to be for that situation.
I think Adam said it like 10 times too. It's like the adventure path is supposed to be the most exciting 3 months of your whole life, where you go from level 1 to 20. Like, I don't know. Some of them.
Oh man,
There's some good ones in there.
Most of them, actually. I don't think. I mean, they can have motivations and stuff, but I don't think the backstory itself should necessarily be a driver for whether or not the character can be a part of the campaign. I mean, that's the same thing. Some people just like writing big backstories, and you're never going to get them to not. But you can't write all of that into a campaign. So you got to leave. If you want to be a part of the party, you got to leave some of that on the table, or, you know, to all of your suggestions, either have the character written off or something along those lines.
Yeah. I myself just like writing things in that oppose or challenge character beliefs or ideals, just to see if they'll stick to them or change themselves.
I said this already, but you're
overcome them.
shit testing their convictions.
Yeah.
Yep.
All the ways.
I love it. I
Mhm.
love doing that. to
All
players.
story is about testing a person from who they were at the beginning to through who they are at the end of the story. So why wouldn't we do that too?
That makes good story. There's
Yeah.
there's no good story that exists where the hero had it just, you know, smooth sailing the entire way. That's
You need
not
conflict.
a good story.
Mhm.
Conflict
You need
needs to be
conflict
there.
for sure.
That's
Yeah.
what I've always
I like-
said about the Monster Mash AP I'm running, is like, At the end of the day, you're going to learn that you were the monsters the whole time. That's what I want this to be.
Oh,
Turns
man.
out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, next question. This one's from Bipolar Pop Tart. Everybody's
Yeah.
like middle of the road breakfast pastry. How many times do you mention the next story beat, like an ignored GPS signal, before it officially becomes railroading?
Oh,
Like,
take a left turn to encounter the Celestial Menagerie. Like that sort of thing?
Or like
Well,
telling
like-
them what's happening next?
Like you've given them a pretty clear indicator. They missed it the first time. You bring in an NPC that says, "Hey, you should really be going over here," and they go this way. You know, at what point does it just be like, "Hey guys, you got to go here"? You know,
that's at the time you take or do something to something or someone that they like. And that is the motivator to actually get in there.
You don't get my benign attempts?
Yeah.
Fine, then you lose shit.
Yeah.
You lose shit. You get bad stuff happening to you now.
Oh man.
There's things happening in this town, and if
I
you're
tried to be
ignoring 'em,
tepid
they're gonna
about
get
this.
worse until they affect you. That's how things work.
Oh man.
You don't care about unemployment? How about being unemployed? How do you feel about it then?
Oh man, driving it home there, buddy.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because then that begins to be the conversation of when do you jump ship on that AP and go to another one, right?
True.
When does that breaking off point happen? And I think
Yeah, but I think here it's a very distinct line between they're not taking the hook because they don't want to, or they're not getting it.
oh, it's the
And
difference
here's
between-
where I feel
okay,
like they're
all right,
not
that's
getting
fair.
it, versus like I totally agree with you. If they're not taking the hook over and over, then and they
Yeah.
totally get what it's about because you're being plain as day, then yeah, maybe we
fuck 'em
got to go
up.
do something
Fuck 'em
else.
up.
But
Yeah,
yeah, if they're not getting it,
that's
like,
when you bust out that switchblade.
I don't know. If you're in 2E, just introduce an investigator NPC that's like, oh, hey, what you're doing is red herring.
That's odd.
You know, that something's odd over there.
Oh, God.
You ever heard of a MacGuffin?
They should just have a class feat called Spot MacGuffin. I mean,
Spot
come on.
MacGuffin.
Right. That's what it
MacGuffin
is.
sense. Give MacGuffin sense out to 60 feet.
Yeah.
Oh my God, yes. Oh man,
Or like, oh, that's foreshadowing for sure.
yeah. Oh boy,
Introduce Deadpool.
no. We gotta keep going because then now we're starting to breach into characters that are placed into the story specifically to like
Quest
like
givers.
AP splain what's going on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, they like pull up a chair, spread their legs out in front of you, and be like, "Here's the plot."
Yeah, right.
me tell you.
Exactly.
Yeah, Tom Exposition, I think.
That's
is
what I've
as.
been trying to avoid saying, but yes, it's exactly Tom Exposition. Like at some point, do you have somebody in there who's just the fourth wall breaking dude that says, "This is what we're doing now"?
Yeah, and I mean, I've been able to kind of push that difficulty to the side by having a person or an NPC that does have some authority or perceived authority over the PCs, and when they see somebody that they respect what they're telling them to do because they're getting paid or whatever, they're gonna feel like they're not getting railroaded as much as just like, all right, we'll help this guy out. This is what, why not, you know? And I think giving them logical reason to take the hook, take the bait, it goes a long way into avoiding the feeling of railroading. And however many different ways you want to actually go about it, there's infinite.
All right, good stuff. We got a player advice question.
Okay.
Seems like Big Mood kind of had an inside idea about this because he asked a player advice question ahead of time. How do you make your team of PCs closer to one another, even if they're not estranged, but they're not really acting like friends? You know, how do you as a GM facilitate a disparate group of PCs coming together.
Was it from a GM's perspective or from a player's perspective?
I guess
You
it's
said it was
Probably
a-
player.
it is player because so as a player, what can you do to help that?
You know, there was a thing that I used to do years ago when Ultimate Campaign came out for first edition. They had a background generator. It was almost like a little Session Zero minigame where you would roll a percentile die, and then the player to the left of you would roll a percentile die, and depending on the result, that would create a tie between you and that player. You know, off of a table.
Nice.
It was really interesting, but you know, it might feel really hokey, and it might even feel like a way to divide the party to an extent. But if you forge a relationship with another player's character before even entering into the campaign, that would be a good way for, like, you know, you're the brother or sister to the other player's character, or, you know, mentor,
Like,
whatever.
I have a good example of this in a All on the Table that hasn't been released yet.
Oh, getting there.
Griff and I had two characters, didn't know each other when we started the campaign, but when it came time to like actually start the story, I was like, okay, my guy, he's not necessarily like a leader person. He'd probably be like the muscle for somebody else. Does anybody have that kind of character they probably would have a bit of muscle for or whatever? And Griff was like, yeah, my guy might take on that kind of help and stuff like that. So those are just asking the people around you to, if they would accept your ideas, is just kind of the basis of the game, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, what I would give advice to a player who's trying to influence their party as a player, one thing that I think that we tend to do as players is get very self-absorbed in our character and what they can do and how and what cool thing they're going to do on their turn. I would suggest, if you're having trouble gelling as a party, is to look and see what the other characters are interested in, what they're capable of doing, and how can you set them up to look good. I mean, if you do that, you're going to gain their attention, right? And hopefully they'll return the favor to you at some point. But if you think beyond your character sheet and you think about how does my sheet interact with the other people here, and use the mechanics as a bridge to the RP of, well, I can do this skill, which will interact really well with this skill. How can we have an RP moment about that realization? You know, that's what we do in our little interlude episodes, you know, when we're on the starship and we're doing the level up episodes and we're role playing all the level ups. Oftentimes it's a few of the characters together, learning together from each other, you know. And then another thing that Heath did just kind of on his own when we started this is he was adamant about knowing John's character before we started. Like he part of their backstory was that they've been their partners, they're business owners, you know, and ever since then, that's been something that we've kind of like talked about, you know, and integrated into when we're creating a new party. Is like, some of these characters might know each other because they're coming here for such a similar reason, why it's not out of this world that they might know each other, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, Tyler, that gets you on the right foot from the get-go.
Yeah.
And,
sometimes you don't have like actual sway in that decision though. So I think when you're in a party that doesn't actually have that connection, you know, say it's 5 sessions in and you're still not gelling.
Mm-hmm.
I like what you're saying there. And that's what I always do as a player, is I always go to the other players about what I know that their characters are good about in character. I will go to the other characters, and like, if we have a healer, and I'm the big dumb guy, I go to them and I'm like a curious puppy dog about how they do that. And I'm like, you know, because it gives them an opportunity to stand up on a platform and discuss like their god, or like how they do that, and describe how they do these things. And that makes the connection better from both a character and a player and a player perspective. When you give them that spotlight and you set them up for that, it's always good. And I've found that in parties where you have a specific connection, you become less connected to the rest of the party. And so it's that much more important to reach out to each other party member and be really focused in, because you got to think of yourself as you're playing this character. This character is going to know, like, hey, that dude blasts magic out of his hands. Like, I'm a barbarian. That's so cool. Like, he killed a dude before he could stab me in the chest. That's awesome. Like, I want to talk about that. Or like, hey, I want to really thank you because like you saved my ass in that last combat. I was surrounded and you literally just like shot a burst of flame and killed 3 things that were in front of me. Like, that was amazing. And that's how you form those connections, through shared experience and through knowing what the other characters are good at and want to talk about.
Yeah, I think that just extrapolates to just general like life advice, you know, is that if you want to connect with somebody, engage with them on their interests. You know what I mean? Like, be interested in what they are interested in. Like, that's just kind of a thing that I do as a person with other people, is I want them to share what they're interested in with me to connect with them. You know what I mean? And so that goes all the way down to when you're playing characters that need to bond. You like Griffin said, like if it's something really cool that your character would not have a lot of experience with, why are you not talking to them about it and boosting that up? You know,
my favorite thing to do is when you have that one player that wants to play the like loner edgelord character, to be the super persistent character that like really wants to know, like is really genuinely curious about them. And like over time, you end up endearing yourself to that character and they come out of their shell as a loner and integrate with the party better.
And that's how all like stories about loner characters kind of come about. It's about them being contacted by somebody who's not a loner character and bringing them into this light of not being a loner anymore. Perks of being
just gotta be persistent.
For one.
So
persistence is key.
So don't shit talk the edgelord in your party. Go reach a hand out to them and ask them to tell their story. Yeah. Oh,
or like brood with them. Go brood with them, and they will not want to brood anymore when they have a partner to brood.
This sucks. You're right.
Yeah. Don't seek the spotlight. Be the spot up.
Yeah,
there you go,
from a GM standpoint of this question, just allow there to be space where characters don't necessarily have a looming threat that they need to deal with at this exact moment, and let them just talk to each other and see how they are around a fire or on the spaceship driving around or something like that.
Make sure you give them the opportunity to bond. You know,
I always find myself really drawn to, I mean, and it ranges from like good to evil on the spectrum, but really generous characters to the people that like are close to them. I don't know why, but that always seems to work in this whole like party forming. It's like if you have a character that's really generous, that doesn't necessarily, for whatever reason, and you can make it for, you know, nefarious reasons, that certainly happened, but like a generous character definitely tends to pull the rest of the party members towards them as like, oh, hey, remember when I gave you that? Like, I gave you that because I know you're this way. Or, hey, my character will always like offer you a smoke, or offer to loan you 25 gold or whatever. And it always ends up being like a better, closer knit party because you have that character that's always super generous to everybody else. And then, you know, when you die, everybody buys you a scroll of true resurrection because you were like the one that spent all your gold on all their shit and did nice stuff.
He was just the heart of the party. We have to bring him back.
He was so nice.
I can't afford my arrows without him.
Watch my dog that weekend.
I can't track arrows again. Damn it.
All right. I think we have one more question, and then we're going to call it. Eli, most of your questions we talked about, so I hope you got what you were looking for there. This one is, again, we're going to wrap it up with Jason Laptop one more time. what are some common tools and methodologies you all use as GMs to nudge players in the direction that you want? Example, I oftentimes use secret notes or one-on-one convos to represent deity intervention.
Oh, interesting.
Gotcha.
Deity intervention is a really good one.
Yeah.
But you cannot use that. You can't overuse it.
Yeah,
you have to
it's
be
a subtle
really
push on
sparing.
that. Yeah.
You got like once or twice a campaign.
Yeah,
Seriously,
Yeah.
like you,
definitely leaned on that one a little bit for one of my inquisitors, and it's definitely a good way to be like, hey, there's something that my god doesn't like here that I'm gonna do for them, because that's what we do, and that's definitely a cool thing. And then maybe one book can highlight that more than the others, and then you kind of trickle that through some other books, or because you don't want to make every book just the god main character's book. So like if you can focus on that kind of experiment in a section or a book or whatever, what have you, or here and there throughout the thing, you'll find that character is definitely going to stay on your rails if done more sparingly, or you don't give them direct direct instructions on how to get it done. You'd be like, hey, this thing's around this area, you should, I don't know, go check it out. Your god's like, hey, I'm just a herald of your god. You don't even have to have interactions straight with your god. You can use a herald, and then there's like less that herald can like do to change the situation for the game. It's like, I'm just here talking about what my god sent me to tell you.
right.
Although, feel free to use the god thing all the time if the god is the BBEG of your campaign.
Well, then yes,
True dat.
yes.
Use it all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
True dat. And
Just know is if you're like talking as a god that is friendly to a character, I think it's really difficult and almost unfair to expect that a player wouldn't be thinking that it's the GM talking directly to them. You know what I mean? Like you got to realize that there's responsibility with vocalizing an all-seeing, all-powerful God, right?
Ooh.
Like
Treading thin ground there.
Yeah, like that. Well, I mean, because they're gonna say, "Oh, okay, this is basically just the GM's way of telling me I can or can't do this." You know what I mean, or that I need to. So I agree with you, Allard, that I like the idea of having a herald or having like some sort of like vague sign from the god rather than explicit instructions. That's, you know, some things that are left to the interpretation, that because gods exist above and beyond mortal thoughts, you know, like they don't give a shit when it comes down to like your day-to-day activity, you know. And to try to communicate directly, you're basically speaking with the voice of the GM as God type thing, and that's why you got to be sparing with that.
I agree.
If you're using it for that reason.
Yeah, I agree with the sparing. I will go ahead and say from my own personal opinion on, I agree with the vast majority of what you say, except for it should happen once every campaign, in my opinion. And only when applied correctly, right? Like, don't speak as a deity to a cleric because you need to keep them on the rails, right? But speak to the player from the deity's standpoint, right? They don't even have to be a cleric of that particular deity. Sometimes it's fun just to insert an extra planar entity into the party like conversation just to see what they do with it. And that's I think it's an interesting thing to do.
Yeah,
that's what I
I'm
love.
not
It's like
opposed.
a god that no one worships.
Yeah.
It's a god that no one worships that is either being communed with or interceding. And then it's like, well, why did all these bad things happen to me? Well, you don't worship me. Why the fuck would I care about you? I'm talking to you about the right now. Like the thing that is important, you stopping this earth-ending threat or this Galarian ending threat. But I didn't care about you before until you went on this path.
Yeah, I was going to say, to an extent, you're talking about players who are playing characters who are heroes, which is why I think that there should be some sort of not divine intervention necessarily, but
Yeah,
deities
yeah.
would have interest in what the players are encountering.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I definitely don't disagree about using deities in your story, to kind of like as a motivation device for your players. I guess I was more talking about using the deified intervention, the Deus Ex Machina type of thing, where you're like, all right, you guys aren't doing the story that I want you to do. So here I am as Desna being like, if you don't get back on track, I'm gonna strip all your powers. Like that's not fun or interesting even.
I've
No,
been
I would agree.
I've been kind of able to do that with a Inquisitor of Pharasma because she's like the god of prophecy a little bit, but prophecy in it of itself has been loopy since Eridan died. So she can speak to them about them kind of being on the right track, but she really can't see how things are going to play out and like give them an exact plan. She's like, just trust your instincts and hopefully they will lead you to the right place, but you are on the right track. Stay steadfast, young one.
To get us back to the core of Jason Laptop's question, it's more about what tools do we use? If we're not using deities for that, what are some other ways that we can nudge our players back towards what we're trying to get them to do without really breaking that illusion of choice or making it obvious that they're railroaded?
We definitely already talked about consequences, and I think going hand in hand with consequences is just, I mean, as a GM, think about your world as a living world. Even if it's not consequences, like stuff is happening. Stuff is, the players are making a choice to miss out on the rest of the world because they're doing what they're doing. That's a decision that they have made. And whether for good or for bad, when they come back to the main story, or if they come back to the main story, it's different. And it should be. I think the consequences are how you get them back on the railroad. But honestly, like, I mean, shit, if you had an adventure going one way and you have your party going the other way, I mean, you could just have like NPCs they liked move on. Like that's a consequence. That's not necessarily a terrible consequence. It's just like, I mean, that hurts. Like people that you became friends with are like moving on, or they're like, well, you're not necessarily the hero I thought you were. We thought you were going to save us from X, and that didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead and go over there and get your like ship of gold or whatever. We thought you were going to save us from the werewolf infestation, but it's cool.
Guilt.
No hard feelings.
Guilt is a tool. That's what we're saying, right?
It's a tool.
And you never thought the Catholic Church would be into TTRPGs,
right? No, I think guilt is that's a real tool that you can use for sure. I'm going to kind of call back a little bit to what Pickle said earlier on. Whether you go north or south, there's always a bridge. Maybe if having them go that far off the rails because of player choices would be so detrimental to the overall story, maybe change where the rails exist and just let them keep going, but with the same story. There's a choice that has to be made there, because I agree with Griff, but there is the other option, which is to just throw the story in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, to throw even more into the gumbo, it's like one thing you could do is try to figure out what it is about the direction that they're going that's interesting them. Like try to find the root of, okay, so why are they going this way? Not really what about it, but why are they motivated to go that way? Yeah. And then once you get to the core of that motivation, transfer that to the story that you want them to go on. A very simple, but like maybe too simple of an example. If they're just chasing down some loot, right? Well, show them that there's better loot over here. Like if that's what the players are interested in, that we're interested in loot. Okay, well, then I need to adjust what's happening in the main story, because just from a meta level, my players are more interested in finding good loot than they are investigating a murder mystery.
And right? I think that's a good barometer too, because that might be telling you that like, hey, I haven't really included enough loot in this main storyline. Like,
Right,
I mean,
right.
sometimes there are APs that don't have that. And if you have a very loot driven party, sometimes it's very unsatisfying going on some of these adventures where it's like, cool, I got 2 magic items in a book and like I'm half my wealth per level and this sucks. Like,
Yeah,
and
for
that's
sure.
a perfect opportunity. Like, once you realize that, you realize, oh, hey, when I homebrew, I just generally do the normal wealth by level. They seem to love that shit. Oh, well, maybe I should be incorporating that in the main game.
Or they're chasing down a goblin warren just because they're thirsty for combat because the main story doesn't have any combat. Well, maybe your players aren't into doing the investigating thing, and that's okay. Like, so strip that back and have one of your goblins lead you to a house where the main clue is, because you know that they're going to chase the combat, or maybe they're more engaged in investigating and are not going to that dungeon that you want them to do. Add some clues to your mystery that will incite them to go to that cave or wherever the next stop is. Read your players and see what is the root of why they're deviating away from the story, and then isolate those motivations and amp them up in your main story, and hopefully that'll draw them back.
Yeah, and for an example, I have a PC wanted to seek out an NPC that had left, and I had moved them away to see how they would deal with the loss or whatever. And even though they wanted to seek them out and maybe leave the party, and then you just kind of give that NPC a reason to maybe pick up and move again and put them more along the path that the players are supposed to go or tend to go along with the main adventure instead of having to break off into this whole side quest thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about like tools in the toolbox too. I think as cliche as it sometimes is, a rival party is a really fun thing to add as a GM that really lights a fire under some group. Again, it's group dependent, but if that you'll know if with your group that'll light a fire under their ass to want to continue with the main story. A lot of times it will. A lot of people are competitive. And so that's a really good tool at getting them like laser focused on the campaign as written.
Yeah. Or sometimes I'll make a session drop a bunch of information about the setting in general that maybe doesn't have to do with the plot, just to like give them an example of how much deeper the lore or the information can get in their situation by example of a separate situation. There's a whole mess of other things that is a part of this world. Why aren't you like delving into the details of what is around you right now? Because these details exist in parallel to these new details that I'm just kind of showing you,
I'll add one more thing to a tool, since it's kind of pertaining to the topic at hand. Allow with, sorry, I'm gonna say this and I already regret it, but let your player railroad you for a little bit sometimes.
Yeah.
Right. That's an okay thing to do. The reason I'm hesitant is because I don't let them take over. Right. But pick a moment where it's okay for them to railroad you and just let them do it. That's a tool too. They have a story to tell. Let them tell that story.
Yeah.
Like especially like after combats, that's just like ripe for letting the piece, if there's not some other pressing thing that's time like warranted, you can just like, what do you guys do now after this big thing is done? This person's on the ground over here, that person's on the ground over here, you're still up, what happens? And those are a lot of times good opportunities to just like have PCs react emotionally, or even if it's not directly after the combat, just having an opportunity for you to be like, all right, you guys have at least a little bit to just like hang out. What do you guys do? They can kind of help fill in how they have felt about the recent events. And then that informs you on how to react to future events.
Yeah.
I think another thing is like we talked about testing our players' convictions. You can flip the switch and throw a fork in the road. you can do that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
It doesn't
you
have to
can.
be. It doesn't have to be your, a part of the written AP. You can throw a fork in the road and see what they choose, and that's always a good. I mean, A, you know where you're going either way because you threw the fork there, and B, like sometimes the choices are hard,
Yeah.
especially when the GM poses them.
Yeah.
I definitely think the most impactful stories are about when characters have to make hard choices that you've taken the time to define and like kind of hint at what the repercussions could be, though not exposit the totality of them. That's where like the story goes and how it kind of resolves, you know? I don't know.
Love it.
I think we've railroaded ourselves enough at this point.
Yeah.
Well played.
Blow it
Well
off,
played.
Mr. Bones' Wild Ride.
Well, I suppose that's probably then the time to last call, finish our drinks.
Mm-hmm.
It's done.
Cheers.
Thank y'all for listening and joining us, YouTubers. We want to see you live next time.
Come
Yeah.
on into the Discords. Next month, we're going to be in the Southern Tomfoolery Discord. We haven't decided our topic yet, so tune in to the Discord to get that figured out. In the meantime, everybody at home, please stay safe. We love you, and have yourself a good night.
Merry Christmas.
Too soon. It's too soon, Adam. It's
soon.
too soon. Damn it.
Turn it off.
Get Thanksgiving first.
Not
damn
by
it.
the time that
Have a
Tyler
good
gets this put up on
PS5
YouTube.
release.
Oh, editor call out. That's two in one night.
Yeah.